The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are your ulcerative colitis symptoms proving difficult to manage? Tremfya guselkumab can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. At 1 year, many patients taking Tremfya achieved clinical remission, and some patients also achieved endoscopic remission. Individual results may vary. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and TB. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Ask your doctor if Tremfya can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more, or visit tremfyaradio.com.
Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Try Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost. Built for WordPress creators by WordPress experts. With 100% uptime, incredible load times, and 24/7 WordPress priority support, your sites will be lightning fast with global reach. And with Bluehost Cloud, your sites can handle surges in traffic no matter how big. Plus, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. Get started now at Bluehost.com.
Tēnā koutou katoa, this is Toby Manhire with a special edition of Gone by Lunchtime. There's a lot going on in the world, you may have noticed, and given just how acute so many of our foreign policy challenges are, I thought it would be interesting to invite in David Parker, who is the opposition spokesperson for foreign affairs and is able to speak, of course, a little more freely, if not entirely freely, than government representatives are. And was just interested in hearing his thoughts across a whole range of the very many live issues that are filling our feeds and keeping us company as we try to get to sleep at the moment. Everything from the incredibly volatile stuff that is coming out of the White House across Gaza, Ukraine. We talked about inequality, about social media, any number of things. It's a wide-ranging conversation, and I began by asking David Parker to give us our view of the big picture. Okay, welcome, David Parker. Thank you for coming in.
Nice to be here.
There's a bit going on at the moment, and that's why it's great to have you in here for a chat. I say a bit going on. There was a lot going on in the world before Trump's inauguration. There was obviously this sort of heartbreaking devastation in Ukraine and Gaza, a lot of tension in the South China Sea, a contest in the Pacific, all of that and more. And then Donald Trump 2.0 came upon us, and all of a sudden it feels as though time has moved even faster. So much going on. We've got the other day there was that bizarre humiliation of Zelensky in full public view in the Oval Office. There's the talk of annexing Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal, and then this extraordinary scattergun tit-for-tat trade war that's basically begun with tariffs being thrown out and then withdrawn and thrown out again and back and forth. And just this general feeling, I suppose you, like anyone, is scrolling through the stories and trying to process it all.
Trying to keep up.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. I'm actually in the middle of writing quite a careful speech that I'm planning to deliver in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm reflecting on these issues. Obviously the recent events feel sudden and dramatic, delivered dramatically. Actually, it's great TV. It's one of the things said by President Trump after his altercation with Zelensky. But the underlying trends have been there for a while on a lot of these things. You know, the ineffectiveness of the United Nations, the overuse of the veto in the Security Council, the way in which, on the back of the undermining of the authority of the UN, there seems to be more and more breaches of the international rule of law, which in turn make people more cynical about the effectiveness of the UN. And there's been a bit of a cycle of the undoing of the effectiveness of the UN for a while. The World Trade Organization, that's been ineffective now for close to a decade. And I'm not blaming the US for that. There have been other countries that have been blocking consensus and compromise there other than the US. And I'm not saying the US is faultless there either. But there's some underlying trends that have been the undoing of the consensus that was largely driven by the US in concert with other countries like New Zealand since World War II.
Yeah, 80 years.
A long time. Some of the underlying conflicts that are unresolved just about go back that far. Isn't it incredible that the 1967 war in Israel, since when the West Bank and East Jerusalem has been occupied by the US, and the underlying conflict there hasn't been resolved.
By Israel, yeah.
Occupied by Israel. And, the enormous sympathy that Israel and the people who went to live there had following the Holocaust in World War II has now eroded from the point of view of a lot of New Zealanders, I think, who see the current injustices being prolonged, which is not to forgive Hamas their atrocities in the attack that led to the current war in Gaza, but terribly sad events. And you go back even further, and I think New Zealand can be quite proud of the fact that Helen Clark kept us out of the war in Iraq and other cross-border aggression that was illegal in terms of international law, and we stayed out of that. US, Australia and the UK all put great pressure upon us to participate. Our traditional allies, we stayed out. We were right to stay out because that made matters worse and was illegal at international law because, of course, the UN had already been in there and had a good look around and found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And even after the war, there were no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. It just made things worse. So, yeah, there's lots of problems. There's lots of causes, which we can come back to later.
Winston Peters, as we speak, is probably somewhere between New York and Washington, D.C. I don't know exactly, but he's got a meeting in the early part of next week with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State for the US. And you've just articulated a kind of example of what is described, whatever it means, as New Zealand's independent foreign policy, which has different meanings to different people in a way. As Winston Peters goes to meet Marco Rubio, he follows this procession of leaders from around the world who have really genuflected before Trump and prostrated themselves. And it seems likely that Peters, as foreign minister, will be focused on keeping our collective heads beneath the parapet and trying not to ruffle any feathers with a view to not provoking any, I suppose, tariff warfare. Is that the way you would do it if you were the foreign minister, or do you think that there needs to be a stronger assertion of New Zealand's interests in terms of a rules-based order, in terms of those sorts of values that you touched on before?
Well, look, there is a realpolitik here that means that you don't put your head above the parapet unnecessarily and you don't provoke a response, particularly when things are so volatile at the moment. And so we've actually expressly said that in some media releases that we put out. Look, we understand that the government wants to tread with care here, but that doesn't mean to say that you should not say anything in response to some things that need comment. And for us, a case in point recently that we criticised the lack of response from the New Zealand government was when the US announced sanctions against those who cooperated or participated in the International Court of Justice proceedings. Now, the International Court of Justice is an international court that tries to bring to justice the worst offenders of atrocities that breach the international rule of law. You know, people like, for example, after the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia region, some of the war criminals there were brought to justice. Now, it's one thing for the United States to say, look, we don't want to be part of that international institution, and that's their right. They've got an independent foreign policy just as we have. But it's another thing for them to sanction countries that do cooperate around that. And in that case, the Swiss put together a coalition of countries to criticise the overreach of the United States administration. And those who signed up to that communique led by the Swiss included Great Britain, Canada, Germany, France, a total of 69 or 70 countries, and New Zealand wouldn't sign up. Well, if you're not going to stand up for overreach, which is in that case, in our view, improper US overreach, sanctioning other countries who were cooperating just because they didn't want to, we thought that was wrong.
What about coming out more strongly and saying we think that it is a huge mistake to get involved in a tit-for-tat tariff combat?
Well,
I mean, Albanese has, in recent days, after finding that the softly approach didn't work, has gone much harder, hasn't he?
Yeah, well, we haven't yet been hit by new tariffs. I haven't quite got my head around whether the current level of tariffs on steel and aluminium will increase the tariffs that Trump put on New Zealand last time he was in office.
Because we failed to get an exemption that time, which America did, and Biden didn't change that.
No, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And we've suffered injustices in the past at the hands of many countries, including the US, in respect of some tariffs that are placed on New Zealand exporters, which effectively decrease the portion of the sale price that flows back to the New Zealand producer of those goods and services. Interestingly, in advance of the imposition of tariffs on Australia in the last couple of weeks, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was out there saying, look, this is not the fault of the Australian government if this is the outcome. And I thought that was good of him to say that because it's true. I think we've got to be a bit careful here because there are some underlying truths of some of the criticisms of the US administration. I would say they're a bit one-sided, those criticisms. It is true that there is a big goods trade surplus between Canada and the US, in part because of the tariff policies of Canada. And it's also true that there is a similar trade surplus in goods for the European Union with the US, in part because of the tariffs that they impose. We would say that there is that those are proper issues to be discussed between countries, and we don't think the way through is a trade war. If I could put the other side of the equation, of course, there are sometimes significant surpluses in services for the United States, both those that are measured in their GDP, but also the indirect benefit they get through the tech giants like Apple and Google that are owned by the US, even if they base themselves in Ireland from a tax point of view, which benefit the US system. And of course, the system overall benefits the US to the point where they've got amongst the highest per capita GDP in the world. So the system overall works not too bad for them in that sense. The complexities of these issues, though, go beyond the tariff wars because the underlying discontent of the voter in countries that leads to outcomes like this is multifaceted and includes some of the gross inequalities that you now see developing in Western countries.
So you're touching there on the drift towards populism, towards some demagoguery, and that emerges from a broader pattern of inequality, which you're interested in, and you're wearing your other hat, aren't you? In terms of the way that I suppose tax systems work, for example.
Well, the US inequalities and the New Zealand inequalities are terrible. And I was trade minister when Trump was last in. I saw eye to eye at one level with Robert Lighthizer, who was the US trade representative there. I didn't agree with everything he said, but he did bemoan the fact that US private equity had stripped out the last few percentages of their cost of manufacturing by outsourcing to low labour cost countries like China or and many others, and then reaped the capital value for themselves of the increase in the value of the company that had their cost inputs reduced, from his point of view, effectively at the cost of US workers who no longer had jobs. And there's some truth in that. his remedies might not be the right ones, but I thought Keating was interesting lately when he sort of launched to it, and he's master of a pithy phrase, and he made the point that from his point of view, Australian society was fairer, universal health care from the cradle to the grave, real increases in wages for working median earners in in Australia, very, very significant. I forget whether it was 30% or 50% over the relevant period, compared with nil for the median wage earner in the United States. Good rates of education in the Australian system, rights of participation. And then he went on and said some pretty provocative things like in Australia, they don't shoot their children at school, and when they catch the people that do it, they take the guns off them. He was making the point, quite provocatively, that we have to be careful not to concede that the societal settings that lie behind the discontent in some other countries somehow have some moral supremacy to the settings that we maintain in our own country. And I suppose that's one of the things where you sort of try and sort of lift up and look beyond the current at the moment. What are the underlying drivers of some of this discontent in what were previously settled democracies? And I think inequality is one of them.
We're here to talk about foreign policy, so I'll just very quickly digress onto this since we're in this territory. There was a lot of discussion in the lead up to the last election around Labor's policy, at that point government policy on tax, and you led a conversation around the possibilities of a capital gains tax and or a wealth tax. What is the process? Where are you at now as a Labor opposition in terms of delineating what that policy will be?
Well, we've been having an internal debate within the Labor Party as to how we address some of these issues, and you're right that it's public that if essentially the options that are being worked up in more detail are some form of capital gains tax or a wealth tax, which from my perspective is essentially a proxy for a tax on the income from capital rather than a tax on wealth. The Labor Party will finish those internal workings, if you like, over the next year, and then be clear by the time of the next election what we're proposing, if anything.
All right. You mentioned Keating and Turnbull, and which makes me think of Helen Clark, our own probably most vociferous former premier. She has had a number of things to say about the response to Trump, trying to urge, I think, a slightly stronger response. One of the things she said is that we should be looking at our Five Eyes membership in terms of the mission creep on that. What's your response to that?
Well, her first and most important message, I think, is that we need courteous relationships with both the US and China, which I agree with. I think Helen's very wise in the matters of foreign affairs. She's had a lifetime interest in it and has made some very, very good decisions for New Zealand through the decades. So I respect her opinions a lot. In respect of Five Eyes, she doesn't say that we should withdraw from Five Eyes. She values that relationship, as I do, and I think most New Zealanders do. That's a long-standing relationship that goes back to World War II between us, Canada, Australia, UK and the US, and we add value to it and we get value out of it. What she doesn't like is the increasing branding of other aspects of foreign affairs as being a Five Eyes tool, because she sees the Five Eyes network as an intelligence and defence issue more than a foreign affairs construct. And I think she's quite right to warn against the use of that for a wider political purpose, because she doesn't think it's as positive and constructive a way forward, and is very clear in the view that sitting as we do at the bottom of the South Pacific in this globally contested world, we need to, going back to to your early reference to independent foreign policy, we need to take decisions independently in New Zealand's foreign interest in a way that is not always tied to the decisions of either the US, Australia, or the UK, for example.
Is that getting harder, that balance, trying to negotiate a independent foreign policy, an economy that is a trading economy, a cork in the ocean, whatever, between the American pressure, the Chinese pressure, which has amplified it to some degree in recent times with the focus on the Pacific and influence there. In recent months, we've had some flexing of muscle from the Chinese Navy in the Tasman Sea. We've had, under the current government, I think it's fair to say, an inclining towards the relationship with Washington over that with Beijing. Winston Peters was recently in Beijing looking to kind of provide some reassurances. How do you think we are doing in terms of that balance right now under the current government?
Well, we think some of the rhetoric from the government has been a bit strong. We didn't like it when Christopher Luxton said that New Zealand was a force multiplier for the United States. We haven't liked how we thought the government was softening up New Zealand for AUKUS Pillar 2, using increasingly tough language to try and encourage New Zealanders to back their perhaps view that we should be in AUKUS Pillar 2. Notably, they've gone a bit quiet on that recently.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Does Donald Trump know what AUKUS is, do you think?
Well, yeah, maybe not. There was a suggestion recently. So is it harder than it was? Well, there is a realignment happening in part because of the growth of China. China it's certainly still not the size of economy of the US and may never overtake them, probably won't in my lifetime. But there's no doubt that they're a stronger economic power than they were, and there's no doubt that rising superpowers project themselves more than they were before they were rising superpowers. Now, to a certain extent, some of that is to be expected, and the US behaves similarly in respect of their places that are close to home for them. The recent utterances in respect of the Panama Canal and their concern about Chinese influence in the Panama Canal, and earlier actions over the decades by the US administrations in Central America particularly. You can see that superpowers do what superpowers are reputed to do. That doesn't that realignment that is happening in the world is something that is difficult and difficult for countries that are in the middle of that realignment, like New Zealand and Australia. Our view is that we should be cooperating with Australia and the United States and Japan and other like-minded countries who believe in democracy and the international rule of law, but that we shouldn't be quite so. We don't think we should be doing it under the AUKUS banner, which is plainly described by the prior US administration, and I suspect by the current one as a China containment strategy in a way that we think's harder to find the agreed space in the middle. Now, we do not want to see the militarisation of the Pacific. It's one of the reasons why we've been agreeing with the government and their criticisms of this recent agreement signed by the Cook Islands government with China, which we think's sort of beyond the pale, to be honest.
Quickly on that, we have a kind of almost unique relationship with the Cook Islands, and they're part of the New Zealand realm. But shouldn't they be able to? Aren't they grown-ups? That's the Prime Minister Brown sort of approach. Is we don't need mum and dad standing in the room. We can operate on our own 2 feet. Thank you very much.
As has been said by, in the past, Helen Clark, and currently by Winston Peters, and again by Helen Clark, it is free for the Cook Islands to determine a different future for themselves at any time, where they don't carry New Zealand passports and have the benefits of things like superannuation portability and the ability to use our health and education system. But until such time as that happens, the current deal is that we're responsible for their foreign affairs and that they don't have freedom to march off and sign an agreement with anyone else. And the idea that somehow that could be satisfied with some academic form of consultation, which didn't occur here anyway, but the fact I see some people asserting that that's all that would have been required to make this legitimate is wrong. They need to it's quite proper for New Zealand to say, well, under the current rules of our relationship, those issues need to be discussed with us.
And signed off by New Zealand?
Well, they need. I think the Cook Islands people need to understand the bottom lines that the New Zealand government might have before they take decisions that could harm that relationship with New Zealand.
Do you think it was interesting that seemed to blindside the New Zealand Foreign Affairs establishment? Does that sort of suggest a shortcoming that shouldn't we have known as an unusual situation where we're the big player? Shouldn't we have had eyes and ears out and known that something like that was brewing?
Well, maybe, and I say only maybe. The primary fault from my perspective lies with, and I think there is fault here. I do use that word advisedly. Lies with the current Prime Minister of the Cook Islands. So
you're in sort of lockstep with the position of the government on that.
Look, I think just about everyone in New Zealand that knows that a little country like New Zealand, our greatest defence is our isolation. Now, our isolation carries disadvantages in terms of distance from markets for us to sell our goods, but it is our greatest defensive attribute is that we're isolated, and we don't want to see the militarisation of the Pacific, including by China. So, yeah, this is a serious issue for New Zealand.
Over the past several days, 3 females have been found dead.
Looks like someone's going after these girls.
Then they have to know to watch their backs.
Streaming now.
You really want what happened to this woman happen to you?
Exactly why I need to keep going on this.
Starring Emmy Award winner Amanda Seyfried.
I'm worried about what you're gonna find. So am I.
Long Bright River, a limited series. Streaming now. Only on Peacock.
Take me out to the ball game.
What are you doing?
Did you know DirecTV has the most MLB games?
So, you're singing.
Yeah, they put your favorite teams front and center right when you turn it on. Buy me some cold cuts and flapjacks.
Those aren't even the words.
I'm allergic to peanuts.
Stream DirecTV, home of the most MLB games. Visit directtv.com. Claim based on total games offered on national and regional sports networks. RSNs available with choice package or higher. Availability of RSNs varies by zip code and package.
Hey, what's up? It's Wanda Sykes. I'm here to remind you about something super important, getting your breast screened. Because trust me, your breast health should be a priority. Early detection for breast cancer can change the game, which is why you should visit yourattentionplease.com to learn more. And do me a favor, if you've already had a breast cancer screening, remind your friends and family to visit yourattentionplease.com too. We gotta look out for our girls.
AUKUS, since we're on it, Pillar 2, which is obviously a vastly different subordinate kind of layer to the main subs part of the submarine part of the arrangement for the 3 countries that are part of AUKUS. You and the Labour Party has said absolutely not. I remember before the 2017 election, there were sort of marches in the street against the TPP, and then there were a few tweaks made and CP put in front of it. Is there any chance at all that a Labour government in the future could sign up to an AUKUS Pillar 2 asterisk?
Look, we do keep our promises in respect of our promises to electorate. Let's go back to CPTPP because I was responsible at the time. We laid down 4 preconditions before we would proceed with CPTPP. The first and most important of them was that New Zealand needed the ability to control who it sold its residential land to, because the existing screening regime, or the pre-existing screening regime, didn't allow the New Zealand government to stop overseas purchases of our residential land. Now, I've always been of the view that that's one of the important attributes of nationality, is that you can own what is yours rather than be tenants in your own country. And for me, that's true of the most beautiful section adjacent to Lake Wakatipu as it is for the most modest house in South Auckland, which is nonetheless somebody's dream. That's all they can afford. And so we knew that if the then government had proceeded with CPTPP without fixing that, New Zealand would have lost, in effect, the right to screen for overseas ownership of New Zealand property if that wasn't fixed first. So that was our first and most important precondition. We didn't like investor-state dispute clauses under which corporates can sue governments rather than government-to-government enforcement of trade agreements. So we wanted to do better on that, and there were a couple of other preconditions. Now, I think we managed to achieve sort of 3.5 out of the 4 or 5 conditions that we set, most importantly the land one from my perspective. And on that basis, we thought it was in New Zealand's interest to proceed, as did New Zealand First. So our position on that was clearly set out, and we adhered to that view. In respect of AUKUS, going back to that, what I said earlier, we need cordial relationships with both the US and China, and we're not convinced that the AUKUS framing with the US is actually the way that leads to that, which is not to say that we're not non-aligned. We are independent, but we are aligned with our parties with traditional values. But we would much rather us working with the likes of Singapore, Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, Australia, other countries to cooperate, and the US, but not through the AUKUS banner, which is too directly anti-China.
One of the live issues in just about every country in the world is defence spending. And there's this idea of what proportion do you need to spend on defence in order to have a security guarantee, or however you want to frame it. Are you on board with what seems inevitable now, which is moving to a 2% of GDP defence budget in the approaching budget?
We haven't put a figure on it. We're actually making a couple of points here. From our perspective, the National Party talk a big game on defence and then don't do it. Who's built? Periodically there's really expensive kit that needs to be purchased for the defence forces, and even National does it. It's us and Labour. The frigates, the P-8 surveillance aircraft, the replacement of the Hercules, all done under Labour administration. So we don't accept this sort of slight that is slapped at us by the National Party that we're somehow sort of a pack of peaceniks and that we're not realists. Now, Chris Hipkins has already made the point that the frigates are coming up for replacement, and that will have to be funded. And I think most people see that in the current circumstance there needs to be an increase in the way in which we defend our interests, both through soft and hard power. And on soft power you have proper foreign affairs. Maybe there isn't a resource going into the relationship at a foreign affairs level with Cook Island. Maybe that contributed to the fact that they didn't understand our position and we didn't understand theirs properly. Certainly in the form of soft power, we have to help the Pacific Islands succeed economically, because their interests are tied to ours. Both we've got these deep relationships born of all of the Pacific Island people that live in New Zealand, actually, in part. But we going back to that point of view of what's in our defensive interests, we actually have to do better to stop the militarisation of the Pacific by others. And us in Australia, that falls to us largely to fund the alternative pathways. So yes, we probably need an increase in both soft and hard power, which means defence and foreign affairs and aid.
There is sort of thinking about going back to what you talked about Helen Clark in Iraq, and then obviously we can go back further to the longer years and a fascinating moment at which New Zealand expressed itself quite demonstrably against the hegemon of the time.
Yeah.
Is that DNA still coursed through the Labour Party? Is there an extent to which you think, sort of coming back a bit to what we were talking about before, where a Labour government would be a bit more forceful in asserting our values, I suppose?
Yes, yeah. And as you say, Iraq, Helen Clark was also the person who deployed the SAS to Afghanistan in support of international efforts there following 9/11. But yes, that you go back further, apartheid, the Labour Party took a stronger stance against the apartheid regime than the national government did at the time. Remember, Muldoon Under National invited a segregated team to New Zealand, a rugby team, the Springboks at the time, in a way that the Labour Party opposed. And the nuclear-free stance that New Zealand still has, was it one of the Kennedys said ashes in their mouth, referring to the consequences of nuclear war. We don't want to be part of that. So yeah, I think that during my period in this role, I have been trying to take us back to that, we think, principled independent foreign policy where we make decisions based on what we think is in New Zealand's long-term national interest.
How do you think that would manifest right now, were you the Foreign Minister? What would you be saying that isn't being said?
Well, we certainly would have criticised that ICJ sanctions decision with the cover of all of those other countries. If you can't speak up at a time like that. In respect of other issues, look, I think in truth we'd be being careful with our language not to be provoking a response from the US administration, also as the current government is. I would be behind closed doors, and it is possible that behind closed doors Winston Peters says these sorts of things. I would be saying, look, please don't trash the international institutions. We need them.
You've been in the UK and Europe recently. Did you see Phil Goff while you were there?
I did, yes. I caught up had a cup of coffee with him.
That was probably not long before he took to his feet in that Chatham House event. Do you think that he was? What do you think about that decision? I mean, I don't think anyone. This is when he sort of gave an account of the portrait outside Trump's office and essentially compared Trump to Chamberlain, which didn't go down very well. And I think most people would say that was a bum call on Goff's part. Do you think that was a sackable offence, or do you think his head's been given on a plate to the White House to some degree?
Look, I've got a great deal of respect for Phil Goff. I was when he was our leader, I was there, and but for the lack of timing and the lack in politics, he could have been a very good Prime Minister of New Zealand, Phil. So I've got an immense amount of respect for him. But we have been careful to say that we don't think that the government was acting out of political spite towards the Labour Party or Phil Goff and taking the decision that they have. Now, that's not to say that if we'd been in the seat, we'd have taken the same decision. We might have been a little bit more forgiving of Phil. But from the point of view of the government, they thought that Phil Goff was in the position of a diplomat and the employee of the New Zealand government, and that he crossed the political line from their perspective. As others have said, it's a line call, and you can see that if that had been any other leader of the world or any other time in the world a few months earlier or a few months later, it might have passed by without these consequences, which from, putting my sympathetic hat on for Phil feels pretty disproportionate. But on the other hand, we can see that properly falls within the remit of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we're not accusing him of an improper purpose. So we might criticise the decision, but we're not criticising the purpose for which it was made.
What else did you see when you were there? This was a fortnight ago or so that you were over there.
Yeah.
And then, a lot was happening at the time. A sort of a series of waves crashing onto the shore outwards from Washington.
Yeah, look, I was only there on the ground for about 7 days, and a couple of days in 3 days in London, a couple of days in Paris, and then I went to Sweden to see a former EU Trade Commissioner, trying to get an impression as to what happens next, and particularly palpable that their greatest concern at the moment is security. Trade considerations are secondary for them at the moment. First and foremost is their concern about Putin and the destabilisation, not just of the Ukraine, but Moldova, other former parts of the Soviet empire, if you like. Georgia, yeah, and the border states like Lithuania and Estonia and those that share a border like Finland and Sweden, very nervous, very nervous, because no one trusts Putin, and they think that he'll keep going in one way or another, even if he stops in Ukraine. So insecurity was palpable. I had two people just offer to me out of the blue that they were worried that their children were going to be conscripted for active duties, not necessarily directly in a war, but in a difficult peacekeeping role, which would be dangerous rather than a benign peacekeeping role. It was quite chilling, actually.
Peacekeeping. I mean, there's interesting at the moment. We've got a fragile ceasefire in Gaza, and a possible ceasefire in Ukraine. As we speak, Putin is laying out some of his conditions, but hasn't rejected it. So we may have a ceasefire in Ukraine, which I think everyone would agree it would be welcome. Do you think that's the kind of place that New Zealand could contribute to a peacekeeping force?
Yes. In a short answer, yeah. It obviously depends on what the nature of the ceasefire is and conditions into which New Zealanders might go. But broadly, yes, and we've already made that point. And when we were in government, we very quickly stood up a response to assist the Ukrainians to defend themselves with both donations of money into what's called the NATO fund, which was for the purchase of weapons, and humanitarian assistance, as well as sending some aircraft over there to help fly supplies around Europe. And we've still got service people in the United Kingdom helping to train the Ukrainian soldiers. So, a terrible breach of the world order when you have crossing of boundaries like that. And we're on their side. Yes, we would support the government considering that.
What about in Gaza? I mean, it's a very different situation there. And Trump has, had some strange things to say in terms of the idea of owning Gaza and so on. Do you think there could be a role for New Zealand in the Gaza rebuild, for example?
I don't want to reject the possibility, but I'm running out of patience for an outcome that is just in that region, and I think New Zealanders are generally. Do
you mean you're running out of patience with the Israeli state when you say that?
Yes.
Yeah.
As I said earlier, I'm absolutely not condoning the atrocity by Hamas and where they murdered and raped people, but the underlying conflict is, 67. It's close to 60 years old, and the people who live, the Palestinian people are effectively without rights for a long period of time. And if the two-state solution is further and further away, what's the other solution? It's only a one-state solution, which appears to be very unlikely. And some of the actions in the West Bank, where large numbers of Israeli citizens now live, a lot of them recent migrants who are who bring perhaps even a different ethic to that which is the Israeli people have been used to. This has been quite aggressive against the local Palestinians who live there. It's tragic, and it's hard to see progress. So, I'm not sure that. And New Zealand has actually, through the UN, always had a few people on those in the Sinai and in the Golan Heights. But no, I'm not. You don't know till you ask, but it has to be a realistic ask. And if there's no way forward that appears realistic, I'm not sure that I would favour us throwing our weight behind effectively maintenance of the status quo.
You've just in recent days expressed support as a party for the Clarice Warbrick's members' bill on potential sanctions for Israel in relation to West Bank settlements.
Not against all Israeli citizens, yes, but against some of the individual. Right. And indeed, even the US has actually sanctioned under the Biden administration some of those that have been active in those settlements on the West Bank, which seem to be in breach of which are in breach of international law. We've also said on that a number of things. We think that New Zealand should be helping the International Court of Justice, which is another institution we're part of, determine whether some of the actions in Israel following the most recent, or as part of the most recent conflict in Gaza, are in breach of international law, as we did in Rwanda and in respect to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So we think if you're going to maintain support for the international rule of law, you have to make sure it's applied consistently. Otherwise, support of other nations erodes.
One of the people you caught up with in the UK was Baroness Beban Kidron.
Yeah.
Is that how you say her name?
Beban.
Beban.
Yeah, Baroness Beban. They're great at titles in the UK, aren't
they? A peer, but also someone who's spent a lot of time, I think, on the role of social media for children particularly, but more broadly, it sort of seems a more alive conversation in Britain, certainly than it is here, the role of social media. John Edwards, who's the Information Commissioner over there now, touches on some of this. Formerly the Privacy Commissioner here.
Yeah.
But the impact of social media across a whole range of parts of society. Where is your thinking on that?
Well, look, I wrote to her because I'd read some of her. She had been referred to me actually by John Edwards. Actually, gave me her name originally as to perhaps I should read some of her work, and they don't always see eye to eye actually. So. But so I read some of the work that she'd been doing, and you're right, she was on the crossbenches of the House of Lords, which means she was neither Labour nor Conservative, and worked across both to reach a cross-party agreement that there should be codes for the protection of young people from, applied by social media platforms. And I wrote to her because I don't think it's going to work. Essentially, I wrote her a letter saying, you've done great work, but it's not going to work because I don't think there's been any success so far in trying to find a regulatory path for the excesses of social media, which from my perspective are undermining civil society in New Zealand and everywhere. So I said, look, I'd love to come and chat to you because I have a personal view that the only way through this is to remove the exclusion of liability that's been afforded them for third-party content.
Can you explain what you mean by that? Because that might not be something that...
Well, at the moment, there's a piece in our telecommunications legislation which says that social media companies are not liable for content that is published through their platforms or given access via their platforms to people who use them.
In the way that a conventional publisher would be. For example, the spin-off would be responsible for something published on this platform.
If I defame someone on this platform, or you do, or I do something that's in breach of censorship laws or obscene or if I was to, play a snuff movie or, all those sorts of things, you and
Fortunately, this is an audio-only product, so people can't see
That's right.
the things that are going on. But yes.
Yeah,
it's called Section 230 in the US, right?
Yeah,
the same idea.
That's right. And it's controversial even in the US, actually. Now, that protection was conferred way back in the day when these what are now internet giants, were essentially a postal service providing point-to-point email services. And they convinced governments around the world that they should be treated like the postal service, which isn't liable for what's in the envelope. But since then, they've morphed into publishers. And, after the Christchurch terrorist attack in New Zealand, when that was able to be accessed, and actually in practice still can be accessed by New Zealanders, that atrocious murder of 50 people filmed online for promotion of a political ideology by the terrorist, that actually is banned in New Zealand. So if you access it, you're actually in breach of the censorship laws. But you can, through the use of virtual private networks and using a foreign address, internet address, access it. And I just think that's appalling. There's no responsible behaviour required of these internet service providers. And recently, Facebook, have come out and said that they're not going to moderate content even in the minor way that they were. So is that right? Is that right? And I think it's one of the most serious issues facing democracy. And so I also worry, for me, it's not a freedom of expression issue. I believe in freedom of expression. It's not a left-right issue for me. But I fear that these likes of, Elon Musk and X, you watch them morph as being an instrument for misrepresentation rather than freedom of expression. And is it right that those social media companies can effectively get away with selling a dangerous product? So I would be interested, and I've said this I went along to the Free Speech Union last year and spoke to them at their AGM and said, look, I don't think we should put ourselves in the position that governments are censors. I think we should remove that exclusion of liability and let the courts determine the balance between freedom of expression and the duty not to sell a harmful product, because there's not, in my mind, there's no doubt that the product that's currently being sold is harmful.
You mentioned Elon Musk, who appears to be on the shoulder of Donald Trump at every moment, jumping around and waving his arms. He's also the world's richest man. Mark Zuckerberg has had a bit of a Damascene conversion in terms of some of his values. You mentioned before that they're removing a bunch of the moderation levers that they had before. It would be quite a bold move for a New Zealand government to say we are removing those protections.
Perhaps, yeah. Maybe you could create safe harbours for those that had algorithms that were trying to do the job. Maybe you could have safe harbours for true media content, and I mean a broad spectrum of media. I don't mean left media or right media. And indeed that would, instead of some of those internet companies being able to rip off your content if you didn't want them to have it, which they can currently, maybe that would create a business model for you to recover the cost of the services that you provide for the public as media, which would be a good thing as well. So I know that some of the US protagonists in these debates in their houses of representatives, and it's not just on one side. I think most politicians around the world are worried about this. Beeben Kidron, when I spoke with her, she said, for God's sake, here I am. I've given up my life as a successful film director to go into public service in aid at trying to better protect young people from these terrible effects causing youth suicide and risky behaviours and things amongst young people. And she said, and I'm getting death threats. It's pretty wrong.
I mean, some of this was traversed following the atrocities in Christchurch and at various other moments too, that we're critical of these Silicon Valley giants, but at the same time, the New Zealand government pours hundreds of millions of dollars into using their services, paying to use their services. Is that something that should be revisited? Seems like a pretty simple and powerful message to say we won't
advertise on your channels.
Taxes are mostly paid offshore as well.
As you say, that's right. Tax avoidance bringing
your interests all into neatly in a bow. I mean, is that something you're willing to think about?
I'm not here to sort of promote new Labour Party policy, so I've got to be a bit careful.
See why not?
But you can see that I'm very disturbed. Look, I've been in politics now for over 20 years. I've been Attorney General. I've had a lot of portfolio responsibilities in trade and foreign affairs now. I've got a keen interest in civil liberties. I'm a really believer in free speech. I'm a strong believer in free speech. So I'm not going to be positioned as someone who's up for censorship. I'm not. I'm just saying you shouldn't be able to sell a dangerous product. Do I think that's one of the most important issues facing the world? Yes, I do. Could New Zealand fix those issues alone? Unlikely. Will there come a point in time when the world just gets sick of the overreach of some of these megalomaniac tech billionaires who pay tax nowhere and interfere in foreign countries? Maybe there will. Should New Zealand be willing to be a participant if the world reacts against the overreach by those billionaires? In my opinion, yes. Is that coming tomorrow? I don't know. Is that a decade away? I don't know. But I think we should be having a conversation as citizens of the world as what we think is right for New Zealand. The foreign interference by China in New Zealand is rightly criticised by the media when it occurs. The interference by Elon Musk in the recent German election where he was supporting a very right-wing party who's sort of an apologist for the Holocaust. There's room for better societal settings than we currently have.
David Parker, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.